In September 2009, the bodies of Pastor Gregory Waltham, Deaconess Caroline Perry, and 23-year-old Jeremy Harper were discovered in the tranquil waters of the Fallbrook River in Massachusetts. An investigation would soon uncover the devastating web of betrayal, jealousy, and obsession that led to their deaths. Beginning in June 2009, in the tight-knit community of Fallbrook, a series of seemingly unrelated incidents within the local church would unravel into one of the most shocking cases the town had ever seen, a crime rooted in love, faith, and deadly secrets. At 7:30 a.m. on September 12, 2009, two fishermen set out on what they thought would be an ordinary morning by the river in Fallbrook, Massachusetts. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, and the sunlight reflected off the slow-moving water in golden ripples. The two men, longtime friends, had chosen their usual spot, a quiet bend in the river, shaded by overhanging trees. As they unpacked their gear, their casual chatter was abruptly interrupted by a sight that neither would forget for the rest of their lives. At first, they noticed what seemed like brightly colored fabric tangled in the reeds near the riverbank. One of the men, thinking it might be a discarded tarp or some debris, stepped closer to investigate. But as he reached the edge of the water, the realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. What he saw wasn't fabric. It was a body. The person was face down in the shallow water, the clothing clinging tightly to the figure, revealing a haunting stillness that no living being could mimic. Panic coursed through him as he frantically gestured for his companion to come closer. Moments later, the second man, now beside him, spotted two more bodies partially submerged nearby. The trio was eerily dressed in formal attire, their Sunday best, as if they were prepared for a solemn event, rather than the cruel fate that had claimed their lives. The men froze, unable to process what lay before them. Three lifeless figures floating amidst the reeds. The shallow water rippled softly around them, as if mocking the grim silence of the scene. The fishermen acted quickly, dialing emergency services with trembling hands. The words they managed to convey to the operator were shaky and fragmented, but enough to dispatch the local police and emergency responders. The small town of Fallbrook was soon rattled by the wail of sirens as law enforcement descended on the tranquil riverside. By the time authorities arrived, a small crowd had already gathered, drawn by the commotion. The peaceful riverside, known for baptisms and community picnics, was now the backdrop to a horrific discovery. The first responders carefully pulled the bodies from the water, each step revealing more unsettling details. The victims' hands were tightly bound with fishing wire, the sharp edges having cut deep into their wrists, leaving angry red marks and dried blood. Their mouths were cruelly gagged with hymnals, pages soaked and warped from the water. The book's covers, once pristine, were now torn and smeared with mud, an ominous juxtaposition to the solemn hymns printed within. The victims were soon identified as Pastor Gregory Waltham, Deaconess Caroline Perry, and Jeremy Harper, a young congregant. Each had been deeply involved in the church, known throughout the small community for their unwavering devotion. Their deaths sent shockwaves through Fallbrook, a town where faith and unity were cornerstones of daily life. Gregory Waltham, the charismatic pastor in his late 40s, was known for his booming voice and compassionate sermons. As the body was placed in a coroner's bag, murmurs spread through the crowd. Those who knew him spoke of a man who had brought solace to countless lives. To see him stripped of his dignity in death was a sight too terrible for many to bear. Caroline Perry, dressed in her deaconess robe, was the next to be recovered. Her long hair, usually meticulously styled, now clung to her face in dark, tangled strands. A mother of two, and a devout member of the congregation, she was admired for her dedication and kindness. As her body was carefully laid on the embankment, the stark evidence of her violent death seemed to contradict everything her life had stood for. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. How could this have happened to someone so righteous? Finally, the lifeless form of Jeremy Harper was pulled from the water. At only 23 years old, he had been a rising star within the church, a young man with dreams of ministry and a heart full of passion for his faith. Jeremy's youthful appearance, coupled with the brutality of his death, struck a deep chord with everyone present. Some in the crowd wept openly as they watched his body, still clad in the baptismal robe he had so often worn with pride, being carried away. As the day stretched on, investigators combed the area for clues. Forensic teams worked methodically, photographing the scene, collecting samples, and noting every detail. The victim's ceremonial robes were torn in places, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place. The fishing wire used to bind their hands had left behind not just physical wounds, but also a grim story of restraint and force. Even the hymnals, soaked and discolored, seemed to tell their own story, a cruel irony in their use as instruments of silence. By September 14th, forensic reports confirmed the suspicions that had already gripped the town. This was no tragic accident, no freak misfortune during a baptism ceremony. The ligature marks, the gags, and the positioning of the bodies all pointed to a deliberate, heinous act. It was a murder, calculated, vicious, and deeply personal. The media descended upon Fallbrook, eager to uncover the story behind what they quickly dubbed the baptism murders. Reporters lined the streets, their cameras capturing every anguished face, every whispered prayer, and every grim statement from law enforcement. The peaceful riverbank, once a sanctuary of faith and renewal, was now the focal point of a chilling investigation. As the days passed, the town's residents grappled with the horror of what had unfolded. The victims weren't strangers or distant acquaintances. They were members of their tight-knit community, people they had shared pews with, prayed with, and trusted. The loss was palpable, and the questions it raised were almost unbearable. Who could have done this? Why would anyone want to harm those who had dedicated their lives to spreading love and faith? The baptism murders had shattered the illusion of safety in Fallbrook, leaving behind a deep scar that no amount of prayer could immediately heal. The investigation was just beginning, but for those closest to the victims, the answers couldn't come soon enough. On September 16th, 2009, the Fallbrook Police Department began what would become an exhaustive investigation by interviewing members of the grieving congregation. The small community, still reeling from the brutal murders of Pastor Gregory Waltham, Deaconess Caroline Perry, and Jeremy Harper, gathered in solemn groups at the church hall. Investigators worked methodically, questioning anyone who might have information about the days leading up to the murders. It didn't take long for the name Mary and Thomas Keaton to emerge. The Keatons, a couple in their early 40s, were known for their fiery personalities and frequent clashes with church leadership. On the Sunday before the murders, an argument had erupted between Pastor Gregory and Thomas during the sermon. Witnesses described the exchange as heated but controlled, with Thomas challenging Gregory on his interpretation of a scripture about marital faithfulness. Mary, sitting in the congregation, had visibly nodded in agreement with her husband, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. At the time, it had seemed like a typical disagreement, the kind that occasionally surfaced in close-knit communities. But now, in the wake of the murders, the incident took on a more sinister light. When questioned, Mary and Thomas presented an alibi, stating that they had been attending a late-night marriage counseling retreat at a neighboring town on the night of the murders. However, their alibi quickly began to unravel. The retreat center had no record of their registration, and the counselor they claimed to have met had retired 2 years prior. The inconsistencies in their story made the Keatons a focus of early suspicion. But without concrete evidence tying them to the crime, investigators had no choice but to dig deeper. By September 20th, 2009, a startling discovery came to light that shifted the direction of the investigation entirely. In the quiet hours of the morning, detectives reviewing phone records stumbled upon a pattern that shocked even the most seasoned among them. Caroline Perry, the devoted deaconess and married mother of 2, had been in frequent late-night contact with Pastor Gregory. The record showed hours of conversations that stretched into the early morning, and further investigation revealed dozens of clandestine meetings over the past several months. This revelation sent shockwaves through the congregation, where Caroline and Gregory were both held in high regard. To outsiders, Gregory had been a widower, still mourning the loss of his wife, but fully committed to his role as a shepherd to the faithful. Caroline, on the other hand, was the image of devotion, a woman who never missed a service, organized countless charitable events, and spoke often about the importance of family. But the truth was far more complicated. Beneath her perfect exterior, Caroline had been struggling in her marriage to Jonathan Perry, a church trustee and well-respected figure in Fallbrook. Their relationship, once built on mutual love and faith, had deteriorated over the years into a cold and distant partnership. Jonathan was often preoccupied with church finances and his side business ventures, leaving Caroline feeling unseen and unfulfilled. Her connection with Gregory had begun innocently enough, a shared prayer session, followed by a walk along the riverbank where they confided in each other about their personal struggles. But what started as friendship quickly spiraled into something far more intense. Gregory, still grieving the loss of his wife, found comfort in Caroline's attention. For a man who had spent years leading others while suppressing his own pain, her affection was a balm to his loneliness. He began to rely on her presence, her laughter, and her unwavering belief in his vision for the church. But as their connection deepened, they became careless. Private moments were stolen in plain sight. Their lingering glances and hushed conversations, noticed by more than a few observant members of the congregation. The depth of their relationship came into stark focus on September 25, 2009, when an anonymous tip led investigators to a discarded lockbox hidden beneath a cluster of reeds downstream from the crime scene. The lockbox, rusted and waterlogged, contained a trove of secrets that would forever alter the perception of the victims. Inside were Caroline's personal diary, several handwritten love letters exchanged between her and Gregory, and an envelope containing $15,000 in cash. The diary, meticulously detailed in Caroline's elegant handwriting, revealed the depth of her emotional turmoil. She wrote about her longing for Gregory, her guilt over betraying her husband, and her fear of what might happen if their affair were discovered. But it was the references to a triangle of resentment within the church that piqued investigators' interest. She described growing tension between Gregory, herself, and another unnamed individual who had become increasingly hostile toward their relationship. The love letters were equally revealing, filled with passionate declarations and promises that painted a picture of two people caught between their faith and their desires. Gregory's words, scrawled in bold strokes, spoke of his intention to leave Fallbrook to start anew with Caroline by his side. The tone of the letters suggested urgency, as if the pair had been planning to escape together before something or someone intervened. The $15,000 in cash added another layer of mystery. Investigators speculated that it might have been intended as an escape fund, meant to finance a new life far from the judgment of their community. But the presence of the money also raised questions about whether it had been a motive for the murders. While the diary and letters painted a vivid portrait of Gregory and Caroline's relationship, they also cast a shadow over the third victim, Jeremy Harper. A devout young man of just 23, Jeremy had idolized Gregory, often describing him as a father figure. He had recently been baptized by Gregory and spent countless hours volunteering at the church. Investigators learned that Jeremy had often been present during Gregory and Caroline's private moments, an unwitting witness to their growing closeness. The discovery of the lockbox suggested that Jeremy might have known more than he let on. Had he stumbled upon their affair? Had he been conflicted about whether to reveal what he knew? Torn between his loyalty to Gregory and his moral obligation to the church? His tragic end raised unsettling questions about the role he might have played in the unfolding drama. Questions that would haunt the congregation long after the investigation concluded. By the end of September, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The narrative of a brutal crime fueled by jealousy, betrayal, and desperation was taking shape, but many questions remained unanswered. As the investigation deepened, the small town of Fallbrook braced itself for more revelations, knowing that the truth behind the baptism murders would expose not just the sins of the victims, but the darkness that had quietly taken root in their community. On September 11th, 2009, the evening sun cast a warm glow over Fallbrook as the congregation gathered for a solemn prayer session. The church was filled with a quiet reverence, a shared anticipation for the baptism ceremony planned for the next morning. Pastor Gregory Waltham had emphasized the event as one of renewal and unity, a chance to bring the community together and strengthen their faith. Yet, beneath the surface of this outwardly peaceful gathering, tension simmered between some of its most prominent members. Caroline Perry, sitting in the front pew as always, seemed distracted. Her hands clutched her Bible, but her gaze frequently drifted toward Pastor Gregory. Across the room, her husband, Jonathan Perry, watched her intently, his face set in a grim expression. He had been growing increasingly suspicious of his wife's late-night absences and whispered phone calls. While no accusations were made that evening, those close to the Perry family later described Jonathan as unusually quiet, his simmering anger hidden behind a mask of polite attentiveness. The prayer session ended with a hymn, but as the congregation dispersed, a few members noticed an interaction between Jonathan, Caroline, and Gregory. Witnesses recalled subtle but unmistakable tension, a sidelong glance from Jonathan, a hurried gesture from Caroline, and Gregory's attempts to maintain his composed demeanor. Whatever had been said or silently communicated between the three was left unresolved as they parted ways that night. At dawn, on September 12, 2009, the baptism ceremony was set to take place along the calm waters of the Fallbrook River. Gregory, true to his meticulous nature, had insisted on being there early to prepare. Caroline had volunteered to assist, a decision that raised no eyebrows at the time, given her reputation for dedication. Jeremy Harper, ever eager to serve, had offered to carry the baptismal supplies and join them. By 6 a.m., the trio was seen walking together toward the riverbank. Caroline and Gregory walked side by side, their footsteps slow as they spoke in hushed tones. Jeremy followed a few paces behind, carrying a wooden crate filled with ceremonial robes, hymnals, and a silver baptismal bowl. A few early risers in the community later mentioned seeing the group pass by, noting nothing unusual, except for the calm purposefulness in their strides. As the ceremony's setup began, the quiet of the early morning was broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and the sound of the river lapping at the shore. It was during this serene moment, sometime around 6:45 a.m., that an unidentified figure was seen lurking near the edge of the woods. A man in a dark hooded jacket stood partially hidden among the trees, watching the group from a distance. The witness, a jogger passing by on a nearby trail, assumed it was someone from the congregation arriving early and didn't give it much thought at the time. However, this sighting would later become a critical piece of evidence. The serene morning turned deadly in a matter of minutes. Through a combination of witness testimony and physical evidence, investigators pieced together the horrifying sequence of events. Jonathan Perry, overwhelmed by jealousy and anger, had decided to confront Gregory that morning. The night before, on September 10th, Jonathan had followed Caroline to Gregory's parsonage and witnessed enough to confirm his suspicions. Consumed by rage, he sought out Thomas Keaton, a close acquaintance and a fellow church member, and shared his discovery. Fueled by alcohol and a shared disdain for Gregory, the two men devised a plan. Initially, their goal had been to humiliate Gregory, to expose him publicly and tarnish his reputation. But as the hours wore on and their anger festered, the plan grew darker. When Jonathan and Thomas arrived at the riverbank, the confrontation escalated quickly. Gregory attempted to calm the situation, but Jonathan's fury was uncontrollable. Caroline's presence only added fuel to the fire, her pleas ignored as Jonathan accused her of betrayal. The situation spiraled into violence when Jonathan, with Thomas's help, subdued Gregory and bound his hands with fishing wire. Caroline, in an attempt to protect Gregory, was also restrained, her cries silenced by a gag made from a soaked hymnal. Jeremy Harper, witnessing the horrifying scene, tried to intervene. His loyalty to Gregory and his own sense of justice drove him to act, but his efforts were met with brutal resistance. Thomas, panicked by Jeremy's struggle, struck him with a heavy rock, knocking him unconscious. In the chaos, all three victims were dragged into the water. Gregory and Caroline, bound and gagged, had no chance of escape. Jeremy, though not restrained, was too injured to save himself. The morning light revealed a crime of unfathomable cruelty. By the time the bodies were discovered, Jonathan and Thomas had fled, leaving behind only the tools of their violence and a community shattered by their actions. The investigation moved swiftly. By October 1st, 2009, police had gathered enough evidence to arrest both Jonathan Perry and Thomas Keaton. Witnesses placed Jonathan near the river on the morning of the murders, and forensic analysis linked the fishing wire used to bind the victims to a spool found in Thomas's garage. The dark hooded jacket described by the jogger was later recovered from Jonathan's home, stained with traces of river water and mud. As the case unfolded, the motives behind the crime became chillingly clear. Jonathan's jealousy had been brewing for months, his suspicions finally confirmed in the days leading up to the baptism. Thomas, embittered by his own grievances with Gregory, had been all too willing to aid in what began as a plot of humiliation but ended in murder. The fallout was devastating. In January 2010, Jonathan Perry was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Thomas Keaton, who cooperated with authorities and admitted his role, received 25 years for manslaughter. The once thriving Fallbrook Church was left in ruins, its congregation divided and its faith shaken. The aftermath was marked by lingering pain. Caroline's two children were left orphaned, forced to grapple with the loss of their mother and the actions of their father. Gregory's once sterling reputation was tarnished by the revelations of his affair, leaving many in the community questioning their faith in him. Jeremy's grieving parents, devastated by the senseless loss of their son, channeled their pain into creating a foundation to support victims of violent crime. The river, once a symbol of peace and renewal, became a haunting reminder of the tragedy. For the people of Fallbrook, the baptism murders were not just a crime, but a profound betrayal of everything they held sacred. The baptism murders remain a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide within places of light. The river, once a symbol of renewal, became a haunting sight of betrayal and loss. To this day, visitors claim to feel an eerie stillness by the water, a quiet homage to lives lost to faith, lust, and jealousy. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates, and you can check out another insane case we have. The case where an Alabama wife exposes her husband's affair with his niece at a family